The arrow hit the post beside Marshall Slater's head with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil, and he had exactly 1 second to decide whether to draw his short sword or flatten himself against the watchtower wall before a second arrow sang past his ear. He flattened himself against the wall. That one was a warning. A voice called from the darkness below. Low, rich, female, and carrying the rolling consonants of an Orc dialect he half recognized from 3 years ago and 50 miles east of where he stood now. The next one goes through your lantern. Marshall pressed his back to the rough timber, heart slamming against his ribs, and looked down from the watchtower platform into the ring of shadow just outside the torchlight perimeter of Velden's crossing. The settlement sat at the far edge of what the garrison maps called the border reach, a strip of land that neither the human townships nor the Orc clans technically owned, which meant both sides were perpetually convinced the other side was stealing it. He was the night watchman of Velden's crossing. 29 years old, lean in the shoulders, with calloused hands from 3 years of hauling lanterns and digging the occasional grave when the old gravedigger's back gave out, which it did every other month. He made 11 copper marks a week, slept in a room above the cooperage, and had exactly 3 people in the whole settlement who he would call friends by any honest measure. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary man doing a necessary job that nobody much noticed until something went wrong. Something was going wrong. "I see you," he called back, keeping his voice steady. "Whoever you are, you're inside the warning perimeter. I'm required to ring the bell." "Ring the bell," the voice said, "and 50 humans come running with crossbows and torches, and I have to kill several of them before I can explain why I am here. I would prefer not to kill anyone tonight. I have had a very long day." Marshall paused. He put his hand on the bell rope and did not pull it. "Why are you here?" A figure stepped into the light. She was tall. Orc women often were, but she moved with the precise economy of someone who had learned long ago that her size could frighten people before she even opened her mouth, and who had chosen to manage that carefully. She wore a fitted warrior's vest of dark, smoke-cured leather laced tight across her chest and ribs, the kind of armor that let the wearer breathe and move and fight without the encumbrance of plate or chain. Below that, close-fitted riding leathers in deep brown, tucked into knee-high boots reinforced at the ankle and toe. Her arms were bare from the shoulder except for a broad bracer on her left forearm, etched with clan markings he did not know yet, though the shape of the knotwork nagged at something in the back of his mind. Her skin was the color of pine bark in late autumn, dark greenish-brown, and her hair was black and thick, pulled back from her face in a warrior's braid wound with a cord of red and copper. Her tusks were elegant, as such things went, rising from her lower jaw in smooth ivory curves that framed a mouth that was, despite everything, full and expressive and presently arranged into something between irritation and restrained amusement. Her eyes caught the torchlight and threw it back gold. She was, Marshall thought with the small, irrational part of his brain that kept functioning even in crisis situations, extraordinary looking. He filed that observation away for later and focused on the arrow she was still holding. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge of this settlement's defense," she said. "Not the farmers, not the merchant council, the person who decides what happens when the Broken Stone clan comes over the ridge. That would be Captain Dressa. She's asleep. Then wake her." The Orc woman lowered her bow to her side, not slung, not put away, but lowered, a compromise. "My name is Ghorza Wildheart. I am war speaker for the Ashbeak band within the Broken Stone clan, which means I am the person who argues against bloodshed before the warchief makes his decisions. I have ridden for 2 days to warn you that Warchief Harrog has decided this settlement is sitting on clan-claimed land, and he has given it 12 days to vacate or be burned." Marshall stared at her. The bell rope was still in his hand. 12 days, he repeated. 11, as of this morning. He let go of the bell rope, climbed down the ladder from the watchtower, and landed on the packed earth road of Velden's crossing with a thud that jarred his knees. He was aware of the fact that he was walking toward an armed Orc woman in the dark without backup, which was the kind of thing Captain Ghorza would shout at him about later. He did it anyway, because the alternative was ringing the bell and starting a panic, and he had been the night watchman long enough to know that a panic in a small settlement at 2 in the morning ended with someone dead before anyone had enough information to decide if the death was necessary. He stopped about 6 feet from her. She was taller than him by a hand's width, which he had expected, and she smelled like wood smoke and horse and the sharp, clean scent of cold stone. Up close, the exhaustion in her face was visible despite the hard set of her jaw. "You said you argued against bloodshed," he said. "Yes. How did that argument go?" Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, more like the briefest acknowledgement of a shared frustration. "Harrog gave you 12 days instead of 6. That was the outcome of my argument. That's not great." "No," she agreed, "it is not great." He looked at her for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "Come with me, I'll wake the captain." She studied him with those gold-lit eyes. "You are the night watchman." "Yes." "You are not armed with anything more than that short blade." "Correct." "And you are just going to walk me into your settlement." "Someone has to," he said. "And you came here to talk, not to shoot, or you'd have shot me instead of the post. Also, you look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." Ghorza Wildheart looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not fully read. Then she slung her bow across her back, settled the quiver, and walked after him into Velden's crossing. He fed her dried meat and hard bread from the watchman's kit while they waited for Captain Ghorza to be roused, and she ate with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that food was fuel, and that sentiment about it was a luxury. She watched him across the narrow table in the guard post, and he had the persistent feeling of being assessed in a way that was neither hostile nor comfortable, but was intensely thorough. "You are not afraid of me," she said. "I'm somewhat afraid of you," he said honestly, "but I figure the afraid part won't help either of us right now. Most humans in a settlement like this would have rung the bell. Most humans in a settlement like this would have been asleep at this hour and let the bell ring itself." He pushed the bread toward her. "I've been awake since sunset. It's what I do." "Night watchman," she said, in a tone that was not dismissive, simply noting. "You light the lamps, and douse them in the morning, and dig the graves when old Petro's back goes." He paused. "And apparently also make first contact with orc war speakers at 2 in the morning. That part's new." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the neighborhood of one. "You have done this before," she said, and it was not a question. He looked up. Something in the way she said it, in the way she was looking at him, suggested she meant something more specific than just the general category of talking to strangers in the dark. "Have we met?" he said. She tilted her head slightly. The braid shifted over her shoulder, copper-wound cord catching the lamplight. 3 years ago, a river crossing at the Threentwood Ford, 40 miles east. There was a storm. A young human man with a lantern held it up from the bank so my horse could see the footing in the dark. Marshall went very still. He remembered the storm. He remembered the river running black and churned white at the edges, and the figure on horseback trying to cross, and not being able to see them clearly enough to know if they were friend or threat, and deciding that it did not matter because the current was running fast and the horse was going to slip on the rocks. He remembered holding his lantern as high as his arm could reach until the horse and rider made it across. The rider had paused on the far bank in the sheeting rain, just long enough for him to see that she was an orc woman, and then she had ridden into the dark without a word. He had thought about that moment more times than was strictly reasonable for an encounter that had lasted less than 3 minutes and involved no conversation. "That was you," he said. "That was me," she said. Her voice had shifted, something quieter in it now, more careful. "I did not know your name. I did not know your settlement. I rode south for 2 days after I crossed and told myself it was nothing." A pause. "Then the warchief decided to burn this town, and when I looked at the garrison maps and saw which watchtower was at the edge of the border perimeter, I thought it was possible that I was here." Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside, the settlement breathed in its nighttime stillness, the occasional creak of a shutter, the distant sound of the livestock paddock. Marshall looked at this woman who had come riding out of his memory and into his watchman's circle and thought with great clarity that his life was about to change in some direction he could not yet see. "Why did it matter," he said, "whether I was here or not?" Ghorza looked at him steadily. "Because I owed you a debt," she said, "and I do not like to owe debts." He chose not to push further, because Captain Dressa arrived at that moment, boots unlaced and temper sharp as a filed blade, and the conversation shifted into the grinding machinery of territorial politics. The meeting with Dressa lasted until dawn. Marshall sat in the corner and listened, which was technically not part of his job but which nobody told him to stop doing, and what he heard was not encouraging. Ghorza laid it out plainly. Warchief Harrog of the Broken Stone clan had been consolidating the Eastern Ridge territory for 2 seasons, pushing smaller bands under his banner and turning his eye toward the border reach. Velden's crossing sat at the only easy river crossing for 20 miles in either direction, which made it strategically inconvenient for a warchief who wanted to move his people between the ridge and the lowland grazing. Harrog was not precisely an unreasonable man, Ghorza said carefully, but he was a man who respected force more than argument, and the argument she had made in council had only bought time, not resolution. What would change his mind? Dressa asked. A demonstration that this settlement cannot be taken cheaply, Ghorza said. Harrog calculates. He is not a berserker. If the cost of burning this town is higher than the benefit of the river crossing, he will find another way. So we need to look defensible. You need to be defensible, Ghorza said. He will send scouts before he commits. What his scouts see in the next 10 days will determine what he does on the 11th. Dressa looked at her garrison of 14 soldiers, her population of roughly 300 people, her one working catapult that had not been tested in 2 years, and her watchman sitting in the corner eating the last of the dried meat. "We need help," Dressa said. "Yes," Ghorza agreed. "Can you get it for us?" Ghorza went still in the way of someone choosing words with exceptional care. "I can return to the war camp and continue arguing against the raid. I can slow Harrog's decision. But I cannot promise an outcome, and I cannot be seen to actively work against my warchief's interest." A pause. "I can, however, stay here for a few days without anyone asking why. I am war speaker. Assessing the target is within my role." Dressa looked at her. Then she looked at Marshall, which he did not entirely understand. Then she looked back at Ghorza. "Fine, Slater will billet you," Marshall blinked. "I will. You have the largest room above the cooperage," Dressa said. "And you are currently the only person in this settlement who has not either woken up terrified or reached for a weapon when they saw her. That makes you the best candidate." She laced up one of her boots. "Also, you'll be awake all night anyway." That was how Ghorza Wildheart came to share Marshall Slater's room above the cooperage, sleeping in his spare cot while he did his rounds from dusk to dawn, lighting the settlement's 12 perimeter lanterns and checking the posts, and listening to the nighttime sounds of the border reach for anything that did not belong. She was always awake when he came back in the early morning. He did not know if she slept lightly or simply did not sleep much. She would be sitting on the edge of her cot or sometimes standing at the window that looked east toward the ridge, and when he came in with the last of the dawn light at his back, she would turn and look at him in that way she had, the way that felt like being weighed and found, if not quite sufficient, then at least worth the continued assessment. "Quiet night?" she asked on the second morning. "There were 2 scouts on the ridge," he said, hanging up his coat. "They've been there both nights." She frowned. "You could see them." "I know where to look." He sat down and pulled off one boot with the exhausted automatic motion of someone who had been doing the same thing at the same hour for 3 years. "I've been watching that ridge since before the treaty negotiations fell apart last autumn. There are 3 places where a scout can watch the settlement without being too obvious about it. Both nights someone's been at 2 of them." Ghorza looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize as respect, the kind she apparently reserved for things that genuinely surprised her. "You are more observant than you seem," she said. "People say that like it's a compliment," he said. "It usually means they underestimated me." "In this case, yes," she said simply. No apology, no deflection. He appreciated that. She ate breakfast with him, the settlement's cook having been quietly informed by Dressa that the Orc war speaker was a guest and not a prisoner and would be treated accordingly, which meant Marna the cook gave Ghorza an extra portion, and then asked her 17 questions about Orc cooking practices, while Marshall ate in comfortable silence and watched Ghorza handle the curiosity with patient precision. She was not rude to Marna, she was not precisely warm, but she answered each question with enough detail to satisfy, and not enough to invite the next 10, which Marshall thought showed considerable social skill. The days fell into a pattern. By morning she ate with him and then slept while he slept. By afternoon she walked the settlement's perimeter, evaluated the defensible positions, and occasionally offered Dressa the kind of strategic insight that Dressa was obviously hungry for and equally obviously uncomfortable receiving from an Orc. By evening she returned to the room above the cooperage, and by dusk Marshall was up and lighting his lanterns. On the fourth evening she came with him. He had not asked her to. She had simply appeared beside him as he lifted the first lantern from its hook, and when he looked at her, she looked back with an expression that said, plainly, that she was coming and the conversation about whether she should was already concluded. She walked beside him through the narrow lanes of Velden's crossing in the cooling dark, and several people saw them and stared, and at least 2 retreated into their doorways, and one farmer's wife stopped dead in the middle of the lane and went white. Marshall said, "Evening, Terrace," as he passed the farmer's wife, and Ghorza said nothing, and after a moment Terrace managed a strangled good evening and got out of their way. "You do that very deliberately," Ghorza said when they were past. "What? You include me in your greeting as though it is entirely normal that I am here." "It is entirely normal that you are here," he said. "You're a guest of Captain Dressa." "That is not what I mean." He reached up and lit the third lantern, the one at the corner of the grain market. The flame caught and spread its circle of warm gold into the dusk. He watched it for a moment and then said, "When I was about 14, there was an Orc man came through the town I grew up in. He was a trader. He had goods from 3 different clan territories on his pack horse, dried herbs and carved tools and small metal things. He had the proper traveling papers from the territorial authority. He had done nothing wrong." A pause. "He was run out of town inside an hour by 6 men who decided the papers were forged. I watched it happen from behind my father's fence and I didn't do anything." Ghorza was quiet. "I was 14, he said. "I know that, but I've been thinking about it ever since." He moved to the next lamp. "I figure the least a person can do is say good evening." She walked beside him in silence for a while, and then she said, "I remember thinking when I crossed that river in the storm that the human boy with the lantern was probably afraid of me and did it anyway." "I was afraid," he confirmed. "That is the part that matters," she said. They walked the full circuit of the 12 lanterns in the dark, and by the time they came back around to the cooperage, the settlement had gone quiet with nightfall, and the lamps were burning gold against the deep blue of the sky, and Ghorza walked close enough to his shoulder that he was acutely aware of the warmth of her, the particular quality of attention she paid to the world and to him. At the cooperage door she stopped and he stopped and she said, "The scouts on the ridge tonight. Will you show me where you look?" He looked up at her in the lamplight. "Now, after your rounds are done." He nodded. And then, because the moment seemed to require honesty, he said, "You're welcome to come on the rounds too." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in that way it did, not quite a smile but close enough to warm something in his chest. "I already know that," she said, and went inside. On the 5th day, the trouble he had been expecting from the settlement's less welcoming residents arrived in the form of Bennick Haw, who ran the tannery and had opinions about everything, and delivered them at volume. Marshall was crossing the market square when he heard Bennick's voice raised above the morning noise, and he changed direction toward it without thinking. Bennick had planted himself in front of Ghorza in the open square, 2 men from the tannery behind him, and he was making his case with the aggressive confidence of a man who knew most of his neighbors agreed with him and were just too polite to say so. "I don't care what Dressa says," Bennick was telling her, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "You're a scout. You came here to count our defenses and report back to your warchief, and every day Dressa lets you wander around in here is another day's intelligence handed to the other side. We're not stupid." Ghorza stood with her arms at her sides, her weight balanced, and looked at Bennick with an expression of cold, practiced patience that Marshall suspected she had been deploying against much more dangerous people than Bennick Haw for much of her adult life. "You are entitled to your suspicion," she said. "It is not stupid to question a stranger's motives, but you should know that if I wanted to scout your defenses, I would not walk your perimeter in daylight with your watchman beside me. I would do it at night from the ridge, which I have not done because I am not here as a spy." "Then why are you here?" Bennick demanded. "Because she came to warn us," Marshall said. He had arrived at Ghorza's shoulder without really planning the geometry of it, and Bennick turned on him with the slightly deflated irritation of a man whose confrontation has been interrupted. "Stay out of this, Slater." "I'm the night watchman," Marshall said. "My job is to pay attention to what's happening in this settlement. What's happening right now is that you're threatening the woman who rode 2 days to warn us about the raid so we'd have time to prepare, and I'm not going to stand over here and watch that happen." Bennick's face reddened. "You don't know that I know she was here before Dressa sent any word out to the outer farms," Marshall said. "I know she could have let us find out when Harrog's band came over the ridge instead. And I know that right now, 6 days out from a raid, we need every advantage we can get, including the one standing next to me, and your tannery politics are the least useful thing in the square today." Bennick looked between them. Then he looked at Ghorza, who had not moved and whose expression had not changed. Then he made a sound that was not quite a word and walked away, his 2 men trailing behind him. The square was very quiet. Marshall became aware of several things at once: that there were about 30 people watching, that his heart was beating harder than the situation quite warranted, and that Ghorza was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something open in it, something that had not quite been there when she was managing Bennick, something that appeared now, directed at him, specific and warm. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Someone had to," he said. "You seem to say that a lot." "It keeps being true." She looked at him steadily. The morning sun caught the copper cord in her braid and the carved edges of her bracer. The 30 onlookers in the square were very carefully not looking at them while looking at them, and Marshall did not care about any of them. "Thank you, Marshall Slater," she said. She said his full name with a deliberateness that felt like something more than politeness, the way someone says a name when they have been saving it for the right moment. "You're welcome," he said, and tried very hard not to look as though his stomach had just done something inconvenient. That evening she came on the rounds, and when they reached the watchtower she climbed it with him and they stood on the platform together in the dark, and he showed her the 3 places on the ridge where a scout would stand, and she identified a 4th that he had missed. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the railing and he was aware of every point where they were almost touching. "How long have you been war speaker?" he asked. 4 years. Since I was 23. "That's young." "I was the only person in the Ashbeak band who kept arguing when the warchief was already decided," she said. "Eventually, he stopped being annoyed by it and started thinking of it as useful. He said every warchief needs someone who tells them when they are wrong." A pause. "Harrog is not that warchief. Do you miss arguing with someone who actually listened?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "very much." And then, with a shift in her voice that felt like it surprised even her, "You listen. You have been listening to me since the first night. You have interesting things to say. Most humans do not think so." "Most humans are not paying attention," he said, and she turned to look at him, and they were close on the narrow platform in the dark, and the ridge was black and distant, and the settlement's 12 lamps burned below them in their circles of gold, and it was a very long moment before either of them looked away. He was still thinking about that moment when, on the 6th day, she kissed him. It was not a grand affair. They had been sitting at the table in his room above the cooperage in the late afternoon, when the settlement was still noisy with its daytime work, going over the defensive position she had mapped, and she had leaned across the table to point at something on the rough sketch between them, and she was close, very close, and he had looked up from the sketch and found her looking at him instead, and there was a beat of stillness between them like the breath before lightning. She closed the distance. Her mouth was warm and certain, not tentative, not questioning, and he met her without hesitation, one hand coming up to the side of her jaw, and the kiss was brief, but it was not small. It was the kind of brief that contains a great deal of contained force, and when she pulled back her eyes were on his and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it. "I have been thinking about doing that since the watchtower," she said. "Since the watchtower was last night," he said. "I am aware of how long it has been," she said, with the precise tone of someone who has been tracking time very carefully. He looked at her. Then he put the sketch aside, leaned across the table himself, and kissed her back longer this time, her braid brushing his forearm and her breath warm against his mouth. And outside the cooperage the settlement of Velden's Crossing went about its afternoon business entirely unaware that the night watchman's life was rearranging itself into a new and unfamiliar shape. "I need to tell you something," she said when they separated. Her voice was composed, but something beneath it was not. "Tell me." "Before this goes further, she stopped. She set her hands flat on the table, the bracers knotwork catching the afternoon light. "In Orc custom, what I just did is not a small thing. A woman of the Ashbeak band does not kiss a man unless she is declaring intent. It means I am marking you as someone I want. It means I am saying in front of the ancestors that I would claim you if you were willing." A pause, and something in her voice went careful and a little raw. "I am telling you this because you deserve to know what it means for me, even if it means something different for you." Marshall was quiet for a moment, holding this. "What does claiming mean?" he asked. "It means I take you as my mate, my chosen, before my people and mine." She was watching him with those steady gold eyes. "I am not asking you to answer that now. I am telling you so that you know. So you can choose what you want to do with that." He looked at this woman who had ridden out of a 3-year-old memory to warn a town she had no obligation to protect, who argued for peace in a war camp, who had walked his lantern circuit beside him without being asked, who had defended him from nothing and expected him to defend himself and been quietly, visibly moved when he stepped up anyway. He thought about the ordinary shape of his life, the lamp rounds, the graves, the room above the cooperage, the 3 friends and the 11 copper marks a week, and the persistent low background hum of being a man who mostly went unnoticed until something needed doing. "I hear you," he said. "And I want you to know that I'm not afraid of what it means for you. I'm more afraid of wasting whatever this is by moving too fast." Something in her softened. It was subtle, but he had been watching her face for 6 days and he saw it. "That is a very reasonable thing to be afraid of," she said. "Give me the 11 days, he said. "Whatever happens after, give me the 11 days and let me figure out who I am with you beside me." She looked at him. Then she nodded once and reached across the table and put her hand over his and left it there. On the 8th day, the raid came early. Ghorza had posted extra sentries on the ridge-facing side after Ghorza's warning, but Harrog had not sent his full warband down from the ridge. He had sent a fast strike unit of 20 riders through the river ford at midnight, using the deep dark of a new moon and a westerly wind to cover the sound, and the first sign Marshall had was not the sentries shouting but the sudden smell of smoke. He was on the south side of the perimeter, lighting the midnight check lantern near the grain storage when the smell hit him. He turned and saw the orange glow near the east gate, and for 1/2 second he stood very still, processing. Then he ran. The east gate was already burning. Someone had hit the gate post with a fire arrow, and the dry timber of the structure was catching fast, and in the gap where the gate was beginning to give way, the silhouettes of mounted riders pressed against the edge of the light. Marshall's bell rope was at the watchtower, 70 yards away and in the wrong direction. He grabbed the fire bucket hanging from the nearest post, which was a gesture, not a solution. "Get back from the gate." He shouted at the 2 sentries who were frozen near the gate post, and they scrambled, and he ran for the bell rope. He had not gone 30 feet when Ghorza came out of the dark beside him. She had her bow in her hands, and she was moving at a run, not from the cooperage direction but from the south wall, and she must have gone out over the wall by the handhold she had quietly noted and filed away in the first 2 days. She was already reading the situation as she ran, the way a person reads it who has seen raids before. 20 riders, she said, matching his pace. Fast strike. They are not here to kill. They are here to break the gate and the granary and create panic so the main force can move through unmolested. Can you stop the riders at the gate? I can delay them. She pulled up, planted, drew. The arrow left her bow before he had finished turning, and he heard it strike something at the gate line, and someone out there shouted in pain. "Ring the bell, Marshall. Get your soldiers up." He ran for the bell rope, hit it with both hands and pulled, and the bell above the watchtower began its hammering iron voice across the sleeping settlement. In the 30 seconds it took for the first lights to appear in windows, he heard Ghorza's bow sing 3 more times and heard the answering shouts of confusion and pain from the gate line. Then the riders pushed the burning gate section inward and came through, and everything got very loud and very fast. There were 8 riders who made it into the settlement. The other 12, he found out later, had been pinned at the gate mouth by Ghorza's archery, which was a thing he genuinely could not imagine being able to do under those conditions, but which she had apparently managed. The 8 who came through scattered toward the granary and the main well and the stables, and Marshall, who was no longer at the bell rope, but at the mouth of the main lane with his short sword out and no particularly good plan, nearly went under one of the horse's hooves before someone pulled him sharply sideways. It was Ghorza. She had abandoned the bow for a long-handled fighting knife, and her movements were ferocious and efficient, and she was already bleeding from a cut along her left arm that she appeared not to have noticed, and she had him by the back of his coat and was pulling him toward the granary wall with a focused speed that suggested she had already decided what needed to happen. "Stay with me," she said. "I was trying to stay with me," she said again, in a voice that was not asking, and he stayed with her. They fought back to back at the granary entrance for the better part of the longest 8 minutes of Marshall Slater's life. He was not a trained soldier. He was a watchman with a short blade and 20 years of muscle memory for work, not combat, but he had enough presence of mind to cover the angles she was not covering and to be where she needed him to be without being told. And twice he came in from a direction a rider had not expected and bought her the second she needed to neutralize the threat. He took a blow to his left shoulder that numbed his arm to the elbow and kept going because there was no alternative available. Dressa's soldiers arrived in force somewhere around the 6th minute, and the remaining riders retreated toward the gate, and by the 8th minute the burning gate section had been dragged down and doused, and the settlement had gone from burning chaos to shaking, breathless aftermath. Marshall sat down on the granary steps because his legs had decided they had contributed enough for one night. Ghorza stood beside him, bleeding steadily from the arm, looking at the gate with an expression that was cold and calculating and very still. "Were any of those your people?" he asked. "No." A pause. "Harrog sent the Lowland Raider Band, not Ashbeak." She looked at the arm, noting it for the first time. "This is not serious. Let me see it." "Marshall, let me see it," he said in the voice she had used on him, and she went quiet and sat beside him on the granary steps and let him look at it. The cut was long but not deep, bleeding cleanly. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt, which was already ruined in several ways, and bound it tight. She watched him do it. She was very close, their knees touching, and when he tied off the binding she did not move away. "How is your shoulder?" She said, impressive bruise incoming, nothing broken. She reached over without asking and pressed her hand to his shoulder, feeling the joint and the bone beneath, and he went still under her hands because her touch was very careful and thorough and unself-conscious, the way someone touches another person when they have stopped pretending that touching them is not something they want to do. "You did not break anything," she confirmed. "Told you. You also did not run," she said. Her voice was different now, the operational flatness of the crisis stripped away, something underneath it that was rougher and more honest. "When it was very bad at the granary entrance, you did not run. You were there. That is not the reason, and you know it." She looked at him, her hand still on his shoulder, the binding on her arm tight, both of them lit by the distant orange glow of the doused gate fire. "You held the line because you will not leave what you have chosen to protect." He looked at her, and the thing between them that had been building for 8 days was very present in the space between his face and hers, and he said quietly, "Same could be said of you." She put her other hand on his chest over his heart, flat-palmed, and he felt the warmth of it through his ruined shirt. And then she said, counting under her breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. She stopped. Her eyes came up to his. "Fast," she said, "but steady." He could not speak. The gesture was so specific, so intimate and unexpected that it had short-circuited something in his chest that he was not sure had been wired properly before this moment. "In Ashby custom," she said, low and serious and looking directly at him, "a woman checks the heartbeat of her chosen before a battle and after, to know he is alive, to carry the proof of it with her, a beat. And I did not check before, I should have." Her hand pressed slightly, not pressure, just presence. "I was not certain I was allowed to." "You are allowed to," he said. He covered her hand with his, holding it there. "You have been allowed to since the watchtower." She made a sound that was not quite a word, something deep and low and wholly unguarded, and he pulled her to him, awkward and urgent on the granary steps with her bleeding arm between them, and she came without resistance, her face against the side of his neck, and he held her. It was not a romantic moment by any external measure. They were both bloody and shaken and sitting on a granary step while Dressa's soldiers argued about who had been on watch at the east gate, and someone down the lane was crying. But her heartbeat was against him, fast and strong, and his hand was in her hair at the back of her head, and he thought, "This is it. This is the thing I did not know I was missing." 1, 2, 3, 4, he said against her braid, feeling her heartbeat under his palm. Also fast, also steady. She pulled back just far enough to look at him, and her eyes were bright, and her expression was the most utterly open thing he had ever seen on a face in his life, and she said, "I would like to stop pretending I did not ride here specifically because you were here." "I know," he said. "You know. You could have sent a message to any settlement on the border. You rode to this one." She was quiet for a moment. "I told myself it was the debt. It wasn't the debt." "No," she said, "it was not the debt." A long exhale. "It was a man with a lantern in the rain who was afraid and held it up anyway." He kissed her, there on the granary steps, and this time it was not brief and it was not restrained. It was the kind of kiss that makes a point, and she made a low sound against his mouth and kissed him back with the same contained force she brought to everything. And the settlement of Velden's crossing continued its crisis management entirely around them. Dressa found them eventually, because Dressa always found things, and her expression cycled through several things very quickly before landing on something that was not quite approval but was adjacent to it. "The riders are gone. 3 dead, 4 captured, 1 escaped." A pause. "You two want to tell me how we stopped 8 riders with no trained soldiers at the gate?" "Good positioning and fast shooting," Marshall said. Dressa looked at Ghorza. "You're shooting?" "Yes." "How many arrows did you put into Harrog's raiders before my people showed up?" Ghorza considered. 6. Dressa looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "We need to talk about what happens in the next 3 days, because Harrog is going to see this as a failure and either back down or escalate, and I need to know which one." "He will escalate," Ghorza said, without hesitation. "Harrog cannot afford to back down in front of the smaller bands he absorbed. He will try harder." A pause. "But there is something I can do, if you allow it." The plan was Ghorza's, and it was simple, and it was not without risk to herself, which she disclosed plainly and without drama. She would ride back to the war camp. She would use her role as war speaker to call a formal council, which Harrog could not refuse under clan custom, without losing face with the very bands whose respect he was trying to purchase. In the council, she would argue that the raid's failure demonstrated the settlement's defensible strength, and she would present the terms under which the clan could use the river crossing by arrangement rather than by force: a toll arrangement, seasonal rights, a formal treaty. It was not a guaranteed outcome, but it was a different door than the one currently heading toward a second and more serious attack. "The risk to you," Dressa said carefully, "is that Harrog decides your warning was a betrayal." "Yes," Ghorza said, "and he could strip your rank, exile you from the band. Yes, or worse, yes." She said it flatly, without flinching, and then she looked at Marshall, and the look was not asking for permission or reassurance. It was just including him, letting him see the whole shape of what she was choosing. He looked back at her. He thought about what she had said about being the person who keeps arguing when everyone else is already decided, and the warchief who had eventually found it useful, and the current warchief who had not. "I'll go with you," he said. Ghorza blinked. It was the first time he had seen her blink in surprise. "Marshall, I'm not a soldier or a diplomat, I know that. But you going back into that camp alone when Harrog might be looking for a reason to punish someone is—" he stopped, chose his words. "I am not going to sit in my room above the cooperage counting lanterns while you walk into that. You are a human walking into an orc war camp, with the woman who is their war speaker, former war speaker, potentially. With the woman who is their war speaker as of when we arrive," he said, and held her gaze, and she held his. And after a moment Dressa made a sound that might have been a laugh suppressed into a cough. "I need it on record," Dressa said, "that I am not officially sanctioning this, and also that I am not stopping it, and also that Slater has been a night watchman for 3 years, and I am now retroactively noting his job description to include diplomatic escort." "Appreciated," Marshall said. They rode out the next morning. Dressa had loaned Marshall a proper sword, not the short watchman's blade, and a horse that was less opinionated than the garrison's primary stock, and he rode beside Ghorza into the border reach, and then up toward the eastern ridge with the settlement at his back, getting smaller and the sky ahead of them wide and cold and pale with early autumn. They rode for most of the morning without talking, which was not uncomfortable. He had learned in the past 9 days that silence with Ghorza was not absence. It was just another way she was present. She rode with the ease of someone who had been on horseback since childhood, and occasionally she said something about the terrain, pointing out a landmark or a patrol position, and he listened and filed it away, and understood that she was teaching him the landscape of her world the same way he had walked her through the lamp circuit in the settlement's world. At midday they stopped at a stream to water the horses, and she produced dried meat and flat orc bread from her saddlebag, and he produced the hard-boiled eggs and pickled root that he had packed, and they traded without ceremony and ate on the stream bank with their horses cropping the grass behind them. "Tell me about the council," he said. She explained it to him in detail. The structure, the custom, the weight of different arguments, the particular sensitivities of the bands Harrog had absorbed and might be swayed through. She talked about Harrog himself with the precision of someone who had studied an adversary over a long period, and was not yet sure how much of what they had found was genuine respect, and how much was the habit of proximity. She talked about the Ashbeak band's particular history with the border reach, the generations of seasonal movement through the ridge territory, the sense of displacement that underlay a lot of the current aggression. He listened. He asked questions that were not about strategy but about meaning. Why this route and not that one? What the crossing meant to the people who had used it longest? Who would lose face if the treaty succeeded, and how to manage that? She answered all of them, and somewhere in the answering her voice shifted from the official register of a war speaker briefing an ally into the register of someone thinking out loud with a person they trusted. "You would have made a good diplomat," she said, at one point. "I would have made a terrible diplomat," he said. "I'm too direct. You're the diplomat. I just ask the questions." "The questions are the diplomacy," she said, and looked at him with that expression again. The warm and open one that he was beginning to understand was the rarest thing she had. "Most people talk in a council. You listen. You would understand things that the talkers miss." "You're going to make me come into the council with you, aren't you?" he said. "You said you were coming." "I meant for your safety, not to participate in clan politics." "They are not mutually exclusive," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, and he realized she was teasing him, and it was the most delightful thing he had experienced in recent memory. "You are enjoying this," he said. "Moderately," she said with great dignity. He laughed. She looked at the laugh with something like wonder, which got him to stop laughing and look at her, and she looked away quickly, back at her horse, but not before he caught the expression. "You don't laugh much, do you?" he said. "Around me." "I do not laugh much in general," she said. "My role does not invite it." "What does your role invite?" "Steadiness, authority, the appearance of certainty even when certainty is not available." A pause. "Harrog values those things, most warchief value those things. But not people." She was quiet for a moment. "People value them too," she said. "But they also want other things from a person they are close to." She picked up her reins. "I have not been close to many people." He thought about that for the rest of the ride, the shape of a life built around being the one who argues and reasons and holds the line, the competence and the isolation of it, and how a woman like that might choose to spend the rare moments when she was not required to be anything in particular. He thought she might choose to count heartbeats in the dark. The Broken Stone war camp was larger than he had expected and more organized. He had been braced for squalor and aggression, and instead found an encampment of some 400 people that functioned with the purposeful efficiency of a community that moved often and knew how to use its space well. The tents were hide and timber, the central fire was enormous and well-maintained, and there were children and elders and craftspeople and healers alongside the warriors, because a warband was not purely an army but a people who happened to also be armed. They drew attention immediately. Ghorza rode in with the confidence of someone returning to known ground, and Marshall rode beside her with the confidence of someone who understood that how he carried himself in the next several minutes mattered very much. He kept his face neutral, his hands visible, and his posture easy. He did not look as frightened as he was. He had a lot of practice not looking as frightened as he was. There were calls from several quarters, some addressed to Ghorza in the Orc dialect he was still half parsing, some about him, none of which he translated, but some of which he understood from tone. Ghorza responded to several without slowing her horse, brief and authoritative answers that seemed to redirect the questioning without quite shutting it down. They were directed to the warchief section of the camp, and Marshall met Warchief Harrog of the Broken Stone clan on the same evening, as the day's light was beginning to flatten and go golden across the ridge. Harrog was a large man even by Orc standards, broad in the chest, and carrying himself with the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was perhaps 45, with scars on his face and hands that were not decorative and a gaze that landed on Marshall and stayed there with the unblinking assessment of a man deciding how much weight the thing in front of him could bear. "War speaker," he said to Ghorza. "You went to the settlement." "As is within my role," Ghorza said. "To assess the situation and report." "Your assessment." He had not looked away from Marshall. "The settlement is more defensible than the raid indicated," Ghorza said. "The failure of the fire strike confirms it. Pursuing a second attack will cost blood and material and standing, and it will not guarantee the river crossing. I am requesting a formal council to present the terms of an alternative." Harrog looked at Marshall. "What is the human doing in my camp?" "He is with me," Ghorza said. The three words were flatly delivered, but something in them made Harrog's gaze shift to her for the first time, sharp and assessing. He looked between them. Then he made a sound in his chest that Marshall could not categorize, but which did not sound like imminent violence. "The council will meet at first fire tomorrow," Herog said. "Your human stays in the camp tonight. He does not leave the camp. He does not wander." He looked at Marshall directly for the first and last time. "If you touch anything that is not your own, I will know." "Understood," Marshall said. Herog went back into his tent. Ghorza let out a breath that was only slightly audible. Marshall looked at her. "That went well," he said. "He did not throw you out," she said. "Yes, that was well." They were given a tent in the war speaker's section of the camp, which was at the edge of the main cluster and slightly separated, with a fire already laid, and a pair of orc warriors posted at a polite distance that was not quite a guard, but was certainly a watch. The tent was compact and warm, hide walls thick enough to muffle the camp's night sounds, 2 sleeping mats on the ground. He sat on one mat and she sat on the other, and they looked at each other in the firelight that came through the tent's open flap, and he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then after a pause, "No, not entirely." She looked at her hands. "Coming back here, I do not know what will happen tomorrow. Herog could accept the terms. He could reject them and strip me. He could." She stopped. "There are several outcomes." "Tell me the worst one." She looked up. He met her gaze. "The worst outcome is that he decides my warning was an act of betrayal and he punishes me accordingly," she said. "In clan law, betraying the warchief's plans to an enemy before a raid is an exile offense. But you argued for peace before the raid, publicly. The raid happened anyway. Some councils would say I satisfied my duty by arguing and then should have stayed silent. Some would say warning the settlement was still a betrayal." She paused. "It will depend on how Herog frames it and whether the council follows him." Marshall thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to happen tomorrow? Not the best strategic outcome. What do you want?" She was quiet for a long time. The fire outside popped and settled. "I want to end this without anyone else dying," she said. "I want the settlement to stand because there are people in it who are decent and do not deserve to be burned out of their homes. I want the clan to have the river crossing because they have used it for 4 generations and it matters to them. I want those things to not require each other's destruction." A longer pause. "And after that?" She looked at him. "I want to know what comes after that." "With me?" "Yes," she said. "With you, no hesitation. I came back for a debt. I stayed because I did not want to leave. I would like to know if there is somewhere we go after this." He moved across the tent and sat beside her, their knees touching, and took her hand between both of his. Her hand was large and strong and warm and familiar already in a way that should have taken much longer. "Yes," he said. "There is somewhere we go." She looked at him, and something in her face did the thing it did, the open thing, and she turned her hand over and gripped his. "Tell me," she said. "You said claiming means taking someone as your mate and chosen," he said. "Before your people and yours, a beat. I want that. I want you to claim me. I am telling you now so you know before tomorrow, not after, because I do not want you going into that council carrying it alone." She was very still. "Marshall," she said. "I'm an ordinary man," he said. "I know that. I light lanterns and dig graves, and I have 11 copper marks a week in a room above a cooperage, and I am not a warrior or a diplomat or anything that looks impressive from the outside." "Do not," she said. "I'm not apologizing for it," he said. "I'm describing it. Because I want you to know what you're choosing, not a version of it that's been made to sound better than it is." She gripped his hand harder. "Marshall Slater," she said, in the voice she had used when she said his name in the full, with the weight of intention behind it. "You are the only person who has walked beside me without needing me to be smaller or larger than I am. You stood between me and a hostile crowd without a plan or a weapon advantage. You held a lantern in the rain for a stranger on horseback because she might fall. You held a granary door with a watchman's blade against mounted raiders because you were not going to leave." Her voice was raw and steady, both things at once. "I know what I am choosing. I have known for 8 days. I wanted to make sure you were choosing too." He put his free hand to the side of her face, and she turned into it, and the expression on her face was the thing he wanted to look at for the rest of his life. "I'm choosing," he said. She kissed him, and this time there was nothing brief about it, and the fire outside burned low and warm, and the camp settled into its nighttime sounds around them. The council met at first fire the next morning, which in practice meant before sunrise. The great central fire of the war camp built up enormous and smoking into the cold pre-dawn air. The gathered people of the Broken Stone clan arranged in the traditional horseshoe with Harrog at the open end, and the speakers standing at the fire's edge to be seen. Marshall stood behind and to the right of Ghorza, not as a speaker but as a presence, which was its own kind of statement. He was aware of the weight of 400 pairs of eyes at various moments throughout the morning, some hostile, some curious, a few simply assessing. He kept his face neutral and his attention on Ghorza, and when she spoke, he listened. She was extraordinary in counsel. He had seen her precision and her steadiness in the smaller contexts of the guard post and the cooperage and the camp fire. But in the formal ring of the council fire she was something else entirely, the full force of her combined with the ritual authority of her role. And she made her case with the methodical intelligence of someone who had been building this argument since the moment Harrog first announced the raid, and had been saving the best parts for exactly this moment. She did not argue that Harrog was wrong to want the river crossing. She acknowledged the clan's historical claim and the generations of use and the genuine displacement of the seasonal routes. She presented the mathematics of the failed raid in terms that spoke to the assembled warriors' understanding of cost and gain. She proposed a formal toll arrangement with the settlement, negotiated terms for seasonal crossing rights, a treaty that would give the clan what the crossing actually meant to them, which was not the settlement's land but the movement through it. She was compelling. She was also, Marshall could see, walking a very careful line between making Harrog's decision look wrong and making it look simply incomplete, a distinction that was the whole difference between a council that swung toward her argument and one that swung toward punishing her for making it. Harrog let her speak in full. Then he let the council speak. The debate went for 2 hours, and Marshall stood and listened and tracked the current of it and thought about what Ghorza had said, that the questions were the diplomacy, and near the middle of the second hour he did something that he had not precisely planned. He stepped forward. Not to the fire ring, not to the speaker's position, but far enough that he was visible and his movement was noticed. Harrog looked at him. Several warriors' hands moved toward weapons. Ghorza turned her head fractionally, not to stop him, but to include him in her awareness. "I have something to say," Marshall said in the common tongue that the whole camp could understand. "As a representative of the settlement, not its captain or its merchant council, its watchman." A long silence. Then Harrog, after a visible pause, said, "Speak. The people of Velden's crossing know that the Broken Stone clan has used that river ford for generations," he said. "They are afraid right now, and afraid people make bad decisions. I know that. But the ones who are afraid because of the history and the ones who are afraid because of what happened 3 nights ago are 2 different groups, and the second group can be addressed." He paused. "The settlement will negotiate, not because they have to, because the war speaker came to them before the raid and treated them as people worth warning, and that means something. It means there is a possibility here that was not there before she rode south." He looked at Harrog. "The toll arrangement she is proposing is a fair one. I cannot speak for the Merchant Council, but I can tell you that a man who digs graves and lights lanterns thinks it is the right idea, and ordinary people usually know what's right before the officials do." Another silence. It was a long one. Then one of the older warriors in the horseshoe, a woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had seen a great many seasons, said something in the Orc dialect that Marshall did not fully follow. He caught the word for watchman and the word for honest and the word for river. The woman's tone was not approving exactly, but it was not hostile. It was the tone of someone making a point. Harrog looked at the woman. Then he looked at Ghorza. Then he looked at Marshall, and his expression was still unreadable, but it had shifted from the assessing look of the night before into something more like recognition. "The council will consider the war speaker's proposal," Harrog said. "We will have a decision by midday." He did not strip her rank. He did not exile her. He turned and walked back to his section of the camp, and the horseshoe dissolved into noise and movement, and Ghorza turned and looked at Marshall with an expression that made several nearby warriors step carefully out of her line of sight. "You spoke in my council," she said. "You said the questions were the diplomacy," he said. "I figured a statement was also worth something." "You spoke in my council," she repeated, but differently this time, not criticism, something that was almost laughter and almost tears and was entirely neither. "Was it useful?" he asked. She grabbed the front of his coat, hauled him toward her, and kissed him in front of 400 members of the Broken Stone clan in the dissolving ring of the council fire, and the noise from the assembled camp was an interesting mixture of surprise and appreciation and commentary. He was glad he could only half translate. By midday, Harrog had given his decision. He accepted the war speaker's proposal as a framework for negotiation. He would send his own speaker to Velden's crossing within the fortnight to discuss terms with Captain Dressa. He did not strip Ghorza of her rank, which she had half expected, but he did say something to her in private that she relayed to Marshall without full translation, the gist of which was that she had used her role in a way that had gone further than he had sanctioned, and he was acknowledging the result but not the method, and they would discuss the boundary of her authority at a later date. "He is not pleased," she said, as they saddled the horses. "Is he going to act on it?" "No, the council result is too favorable for him to punish the person who produced it. But I have used most of my credit with him, and I do not think I will be arguing in his council much longer." She tightened the saddle strap with a practiced pull. "Harrog wants war speakers who argue for options. He does not want ones who genuinely believe the options they argue for. Eventually, those two things become incompatible." "What happens when they become incompatible?" She looked at him across the horse's back. "I leave," she said, "or he makes me." "When?" "Soon." She mounted, easy and fluid. "The treaty negotiation will take weeks. I will be present for those. After that." She looked at the ridge, the eastern edge of it dark against the morning sky. "I have been with the Ashbeak band for 12 years. It is the only home I have known as an adult, but it has been some time since it was the home I wanted." He mounted his own horse, considerably less gracefully. "What home do you want?" She turned her horse toward the ridge path and looked back at him, and in the morning light with the war camp behind her and the wide open border reach below, she said, "I want wherever you are." It was that simple and that enormous, and he held it the whole way down the ridge and through the borderlands and back into Velden's crossing, which came into view in the early afternoon with its 12 lamp posts and its slightly scorched east gate and its ordinary human life going forward without particular regard for what had just been decided in its favor. The next 2 weeks were the kind of busy that left no room for second thoughts. Harrog's negotiating speaker arrived, a sharp-eyed older woman named Vreth, and she and Captain Dressa sat at a table in the guard post for 6 days and produced a treaty document that Marshall copied out in his best handwriting, because neither Dressa nor Vreth had writing that was legible to the other party. The toll arrangement was settled. The crossing rights were established by season and volume. A small garrison of the settlement's own guards would maintain the ford in exchange for a portion of the toll, which Dressa argued for and Vreth accepted after 3 days of resistance, and what Marshall suspected was a significant amount of smoked meat from Marna's kitchen. Ghorza was present for every session but one, when she rode back to the war camp to present the interim terms to Harrog. She returned the same evening, having apparently covered 50 miles on horseback in a single day, and came into the guard post still in her road coat with dirt on her boots, and reported that Harrog had approved the terms, and then accepted a mug of hot water and dried herbs from Marna, and sat at the table and put her head in her hands for approximately 30 seconds before straightening back up. Marshall, who had been watching from the doorway, came in and sat beside her and put his hand on her back between her shoulder blades, and she leaned into it slightly without comment. "It's almost done," he said. "Almost," she agreed. The document was signed on the 14th day after the council, which was also 3 days past the original 12-day deadline that Harrog had set, and which nobody was now pretending had been a firm deadline. Captain Dressa signed it with her garrison seal. Vreth pressed a broken stone clan marker into the wax beside it. Marshall witnessed it, because he was in the room and Dressa said she needed a second name and he was there, and he pressed his thumb beside his name, and thought that a night watchman's thumbprint in a border treaty was not something that would appear in any official history, but that he was fairly certain he would carry the memory of it for the rest of his life. After Vreth left, Dressa looked at Ghorza for a long moment in the empty guard post, the signed treaty on the table between them. "You should know," Dressa said carefully, "that Velden's crossing is not going to be a comfortable place for you going forward. We are grateful. The people who understand what you did are genuinely grateful. But there are many people who will always see you as the threat first." "I know this," Ghorza said. "I'm not saying that to drive you away. I'm saying it because I think you should know what you would be staying in." Ghorza looked at Dressa. Then she looked at Marshall. The look was direct and warm and public in a way that her looks had not been in this room before now. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "I will not be war speaker much longer. Harrog and I have reached the end of what we can be to each other in that role. When the treaty is fully implemented, I will be leaving the Broken Stone camp." "Going where?" Dressa asked. "I have not decided entirely," Ghorza said. "But I believe Marshall Slater has a room above a cooperage that is too large for one person." There was a very short silence. "I have an extra cot," Marshall confirmed. Dressa looked between them. "You understand this will cause talk," she said. "There is already talk," Marshall said. "There has been talk since night 2. I have stopped finding it interesting. Some of it will not be pleasant." "I know that," he said. "I think if Ghorza can ride into a warchief's camp and argue for peace in front of 400 people who are not predisposed to listen, I can manage Bennick Hawes' opinion." Dressa looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Ghorza. Then she picked up the treaty document and rolled it carefully into its case. "I will note," she said, in the tone of a woman updating an official record, "that the night watchman's quarters are henceforth designated as including provisions for a diplomatic liaison, and that said liaison will be available for future treaty consultations, and that the settlement is grateful for her continued presence." She snapped the case shut. "That is all the official cover I can give you. The rest is your own business." "That's enough," Marshall said. After Dressa left, the guard post was quiet, and the afternoon light came through the shutters in long, dusty bars, and Ghorza sat at the table and Marshall sat across from her, and they looked at each other across the space where the treaty had been. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I crossed that river in the storm 3 years ago and you held the lantern up, I was exhausted and alone and carrying a message to a clan 3 days' ride away that I knew was going to be rejected, and I was going to have to argue my way out of the aftermath." She looked at her hands. "I came around a bend in the river path in the rain and I could not see the ford and the water was very fast and I thought, I am going to be thrown here and nobody will know for 3 days. And then there was a light, a long pause. I told myself it meant nothing, stranger with a lantern, but I have thought about it several hundred times since then." Marshall listened. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have spent most of my adult life arguing for things and people who did not argue back for me. Harrog did not argue for me. The Ashbeak band values my function, not my presence. I have not been chosen. I have been useful." She looked up at him. "You chose me on the 2nd day. Before I had been useful to you. You chose to walk with me and say good evening and stand in the square. You chose." Her voice was steady, but it was not effortless. "I am not accustomed to being chosen." He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his, and she let him. "You are chosen," he said. You were chosen in the rain by a man with a lantern who did not have a single rational reason to hold it up for a stranger on horseback in a flood, and you have been chosen every day since you came back. A pause. And I want you to choose me back, officially, in front of whoever you want to put it in front of. She looked at him and her hands gripped his. Here, she said. Now. In front of the ancestors and the afternoon light. She turned his hands over, pressed her palm flat to his chest over his heart. 1, 2, 3, 4, her gold eyes on his. Still fast, still steady. You are alive and I am here and I am claiming you, Marshall Slater, as my chosen mate before anyone who wants to witness it. I accept, he said, without conditions. She came around the table and he stood to meet her, and she pulled him in and held him the way she had not quite let herself hold him before now, fully and without reservation, and he held her back with the same completeness. And the afternoon light spread its dusty gold bars across the empty guard post, and the signed treaty was on its way to the garrison archive, and outside the 12 lanterns waited for dusk. The days that followed were different. Not easier necessarily, because Dressa had been right that some people in the settlement would never be fully comfortable, and Bennick Haw muttered into his ale, and at least 2 families on the east side of the settlement gave them wide berth in the market square, and there were moments that required patience and steadiness, and the kind of public composure that Marshall had been developing quietly for 3 years, and Ghorza had been developing for 12. But they walked the lamp circuit together every evening, and she came on the rounds with him, and the settlement watched them do it enough times that it became unremarkable, which was the best outcome available and was enough. She was not a settled creature by nature. She had spent too much of her life moving between territories and camps to be comfortable with permanence, and sometimes in the early morning when he came in from the last round, she was at the window again, looking east, and he would stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and not say anything, just be present, and she would lean back into him. And after a while the looking would stop being about longing and start being about looking. Do you miss it? He asked on one such morning. Parts of it, she said honestly. The riding, the open country, knowing the land instead of a settlement, a pause, not the arguing. I have done enough arguing into walls. We could go, he said. Sometimes, if you needed to, she turned and looked at him. You would leave your rounds. Petro's back has been getting better. He could take them for a week. He met her gaze. You came all the way into a settlement and a war camp for me. I think I can manage a week in the open country. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I would like that. They went, the following month, for 10 days into the border reach and the ridge country east of the settlement, camping where they chose, and she showed him the places she knew. The high meadow at the ridge's shoulder where the grass was deep, and the view went to the sea. The clan burial stones at the edge of the forest that were 300 years old, and carried the names of people who had called this same land home. She showed him how to read a trail, how to camp without fire in country where fire was a liability, how to find water in the dry season. He showed her his stars, the ones his father had named for him when he was small, the farmland stars that had nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with the memory of lying in a field on a summer night with the sky pressing down. She lay beside him on the second night and looked at his stars while he named them, and she said very quietly, I want to learn them all. They're not going anywhere, he said. She turned her head to look at him in the dark. Neither am I, she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she gripped his, and the stars went on above them in their old and unchanging arrangements. When they returned to Velden's crossing, there was a message from the Broken Stone clan. Harrog had accepted a new war speaker from the Ashbeak band, a younger man whom Ghorza described as competent and more politically flexible than she had been, which she said in a tone that was resigned and also fractionally relieved. Her formal role was finished. She was released from the camp service with the traditional phrase that translated roughly as having served with honor and discharged, which was an honorable ending, and also meant she was, for the first time in 12 years, not anyone's war speaker. She stood in the cooperage room with the message in her hand, and looked at it for a long time. "How do you feel?" Marshall asked. "Strange," she said. "Empty in the specific place that thing used to be." She set the message down, and also she looked at him, free, in a way I have not been. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bed, and his arm went around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think I have been someone's argument for so long that I have forgotten what I am when I am not arguing." "We have time to find out," he said. "Yes," she said. "We do." A week later, she rode back to the war camp one last time, alone, to collect her belongings and say what needed saying to the people in the Ashbeak band that she had known for a decade. And he let her go because she needed to do it herself, and because he trusted her, and because trust was the foundation of the thing they were building, and had to be practiced early. She was gone for 4 days. He did his rounds in the dark and lit his 12 lanterns, and came back in the early morning to the empty second cot, and the spare mat, and the absence of her particular quality of presence in the room, and he found that the absence was instructive. It told him things about how much space she had come to fill in his daily experience that he had not quite articulated while she was in it. He was fine. He had been fine alone for years, but he was substantially less fine than he would have been a month ago, which was interesting information. On the 5th morning, he woke to the sound of hooves on the lane below the cooperage and was at the window before he was fully awake. She was back. She had her horse and a second pack horse, and the horse was loaded with the things she had carried with her out of 12 years of Ashbeak band life. Her tools, her weapons, the rolled clan documents she was entitled to keep. A cedar box that he would find out later contained the small personal items she never showed anyone. A war speaker's staff that she was no longer required to carry, but kept for reasons she described as sentimental, and he did not press. He went downstairs and she was tying off the horses at the cooperage post, and she looked up when he came out the door, and the expression on her face was the open one, clear and direct and warm, and she said, "I am back." "I see that," he said. "I have a great deal of baggage," she said, nodding at the pack horse. "I have a storage room," he said. She looked at him across the lane in the early morning light with her braid wind-tangled from the ride and her warrior's leathers dusty from the road and her gold eyes steady on his, and she said, "I am yours, Marshall Slater, fully and finally. I want you to know that." He walked down the steps and across the lane and kissed her, right there in the lane with the morning starting up around them, and Marna coming out of the cookhouse 30 feet away and several people already at the market posts beginning to notice, and she kissed him back with her hands on his face, and he thought, "This is the one that counts. This is the one from which everything is measured forward." Marna began to applaud, slowly and a little uncertainly at first, and then with commitment. A few other people in the lane joined in. Most of them did not. Benwick Haw, visible at the end of the lane, made a sound that carried even at that distance. Marshall did not pay attention to Benwick Haw. In the weeks after, the settlement found its new shape around them. The treaty held. Harrog's negotiating speaker Vreth came back twice more to work out the practical details of the Ford arrangement. And on the second visit, she took a meal at Marna's cookhouse and addressed several questions to Ghorza in the Orc dialect, and several to Marshall in the common tongue. And by the end of the meal, the three of them had resolved 2 of the remaining disputed clauses through what Marshall would describe as a conversation, and Ghorza would describe as the most efficient small-scale diplomacy she had seen in years. "You are still arguing for peace," Marshall told her, walking back to the cooperage after Vreth had left for the camp. "I am doing it for different reasons now," she said. "For us. For the settlement I am living in," she said. "For the people who are afraid and would rather not be. For the settlement that was willing to let me sleep in their watchman's room when I came in from the dark." A pause. "And yes, for us." He took her hand as they walked, and she let him. And several people on the lane saw them, and most of them looked away without commentary, which was not warmth, but was the particular form of tolerance that hard-working ordinary people extend to things they have decided to accept on the grounds that it is more trouble than it is worth to fight. Dressa found him alone one evening at the watchtower, doing the last round before Ghorza came to join him, and she leaned on the post and said, in her direct way, "You are happy." "Yes," he said. "Is she?" He thought about Ghorza at the window looking east, about Ghorza in the council ring, her voice carrying the full weight of her conviction, about Ghorza with her hand flat on his chest counting. "I think she is getting there," he said. "It takes her longer, she's careful with it." Dressa nodded slowly. "She came here alone," she said, risked her rank and her position and her place in the clan for a treaty that might not hold and a watchman she met in the rain. "The treaty is holding," he said. "The treaty is holding," Dressa agreed. "And the watchman is considerably harder to replace than he looked." She walked away, and he finished the round and came back to the cooperage to find Ghorza already in the room with her boots off and her braid half undone, and a small iron lamp she had brought back from the clan camp burning on the windowsill, filling the room with amber light. She looked up when he came in. "Long round. Dressa stopped me at the tower. He hung his coat. She said you risked a great deal to come here. She is not wrong. Did you know you were risking that much when you rode south?" Ghorza thought about it honestly, which was her way. "I knew I was risking my position," she said. "I told myself the debt was worth it. I told myself the settlement being warned was the right outcome regardless of the cost." She paused. "I did not tell myself about you. I did not let myself think about that part until I was already here." She looked at him. "Because if I had thought about it before I rode, I would not have trusted the feeling enough to act on it. I would have told myself I was being foolish. But you rode anyway. The logic held," she said. "The debt, the warning, the right outcome. The logic was sound. So I let the logic carry me, and I trusted that what was underneath it was also sound, and I was right." The corner of her mouth moved. "I am usually right." "You are very often right," he agreed. "About most things," she said. "About you I was extremely right." She reached over and held out her hand, and he took it and sat beside her, and she said, "Marshall." "Yes." "I want to take you to meet someone," she said. He looked at her. "Who?" "My mother," she said. "She is in the Rivermouth band, 2 weeks' ride north along the coast. She has not been part of the Broken Stone clan for many years. She paused. "She will want to meet you, and I want her to." "When?" "When the Ford arrangement is settled and you can get Petro to take the rounds for 3 weeks. She looked at him. "I want to introduce you as my chosen mate, not my arrangement or my companion, my chosen." 3 weeks is a long time," he said. "For Petro's back." "Petro's back has been fine," she said, with the tone of someone who has observed the situation carefully. "He exaggerates it to avoid the night shift." Marshall laughed, and she watched it again with that particular expression, the one that was almost wonder, and then she laughed too, genuinely and low and warm, and it was the second time he had heard her laugh, and the first time she had let herself do it without looking slightly surprised about it. He pulled her to him, and she came without resistance, her head against his jaw, and he said against her hair, "3 weeks north along the coast sounds like a fine idea." "She will test you," Ghorza said. "Your mother will test me. She tests everyone. She tested Harrog's last treaty speaker for 2 days before she agreed to sign anything." A pause. "She will test you harder because you matter more." "I'll manage," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am not worried." She pressed her palm to his chest over his heart, and he went still in the particular way he always went still when she did that. 1, 2, 3, 4. She lifted her head to look at him. "Still steady, always," he said. She kissed him, slow and certain, and the iron lamp burned amber on the sill, and the settlement's 12 lamps burned gold in the dark outside, and somewhere on the eastern ridge the scouts who had been posted there since the treaty was signed were watching an empty ford and a quiet settlement, and had nothing to report. The next morning she came on the rounds with him for what had become the natural rhythm of the day's end, and they walked the circuit together in the cold autumn dawn, her step matching his, and he held the lantern up to the last post as he had done every morning for 3 years, and she watched him do it with the expression that he knew now was not assessment, but simply the pleasure of looking at a person you had chosen and finding them every morning worth having chosen. "Ready," she said when the last flame caught. He lowered the lantern and looked at her in the early gray light. this woman who had ridden out of a storm and a memory and a bad political situation, and into the specific geography of his daily life and stayed. This woman who counted heartbeats and laughed the second time she let herself and argued for peace in front of warchiefs, and had ridden 2 days and then come back again, carrying everything she owned on a pack horse, and saying I am yours with the same quality of certainty she brought to everything. Ready, he said. She caught his free hand and held it, and they walked back through the settling morning toward the cooperage. And later that month, when Petro's back had recovered, and the Ford agreement was signed and sealed, she put him on a horse and rode him north along the coast road with his pack tied to her saddle and the sea wind in their faces, and the entire length of the border reach opening out before them. And he went without reservation, belonging entirely to the road ahead and the woman beside him. And that was how Marshall Slater, night watchman of Velden's crossing, came to ride north into Orc country as Ghorza Wildheart's openly chosen mate, the lantern carrier turned border maker, the ordinary man who had held a light in the rain once and found in the end that it had been enough. More than enough. Everything.